The stock buyer came up the lane in the second week of August, and he did not stay 11 minutes. It was the summer of 1901, and by then the heat had stopped being weather and become a fact of life, like the ground or the sky. 31 days that county went above 95 degrees. 11 of them went past 104. The road dust had gone to a gray flour that hung at knee-height behind a wagon until dark, and the corn on both sides of the Ash Grove Road stood in rows the color of a paper sack, the leaves rolled tight as cigars by 9 in the morning and not unrolling again. Ellis Crabb bought Hogs for a commission house out of Delphos, and he had a route and a buggy and a good black horse, and he had bought every finished drove in that township for 9 years. He came up Harmonteel's lane with his coat over his arm and his collar open, and he stood at the hog lot fence with his hat pushed back, and he looked over the rail for a while, and then he did the thing that got told at the elevator for the rest of that month. He laughed. Not a mean laugh, a tired one. The way a man laughs at a thing that has wasted his afternoon. "Harmon," he said, "I have got 4 calls to make before dark and a horse that is done in. What am I supposed to write in my book about these?" There were maybe 60 head in the near lot that afternoon, and the rest were back in the timber where a buyer could not see them. And the 60 in the lot were what a man in that country called a landpike. Long in the leg. Long in the snout, a snout like a shingle made for going into the ground and coming up with something. High and narrow across the back with a ridge of coarse bristles standing along the spine, so that if you looked down the length of one from behind, you saw a wedge and not a table. Rusty black, or grizzled gray, or spotted like something wild had got into the herd 4 generations back and never been bred out. And quick. They came off the ground all at once when a man put a hand on the gate and stood in a half circle with their ears up and their eyes on him, and did not crowd the fence begging the way a proper hog begs. Down the road, in every other lot in that township, there stood a different animal entirely. Short of leg. Deep and square through the body. Dished in the face, so short-nosed the jaw looked pushed in with a thumb. Poland Chinas mostly, and some Chester Whites and a few Duroc Reds, every one of them bred for a single purpose, which was to stand at a trough and turn corn into lard as fast as a hog can be made to do it. The best of them could not walk half a mile without stopping to blow. They did not have to. A hog in Ash Grove Township was born 40 feet from the crib it would die next to. Harmonteel leaned on the top rail beside the buyer and did not answer him for a while. He was 61 that summer, lean, burned dark on the face, and the forearms and white as a fish everywhere the shirt covered. Iron gray hair cut close because he cut it himself with the horse clippers, a short gray beard, deep-set eyes with the fine white lines cut into the corners from 40 years of squinting into a low sun. "Write down that they are not for sale," he said. "I would not know what to bid if they were," Crabb said. He was not being cruel. He was being accurate, and both men knew it. There is no market for a hog like that. The house wants a hog that comes to the block at 240 pounds at 8 months, corn hard, thick through the loin. That thing you have got there is 9/10 bone and 1/10 ambition. I could not sell it to a soapworks. Then I am glad I am not asking you to. Crabb picked up his hat and put it back on and stood a second longer, because he was a decent enough man, and he had known Harmon a long time, and he tried once more the way you try with a man you like. "Harmon, everybody has had a hard July, but there is going to come a day this fall when a bushel of corn is worth more than the hog it goes into, and when that day comes you want to be holding money, not holding this." "I have thought about that day some," Harmon said. The buggy went back down the lane and turned south, and the dust came up behind it and hung there in the flat white light. And down at the corner where Harmon's lane met the township road there were 3 men standing at the mouth of it in the shade of a bur oak with their arms folded, watching the whole thing. Because in a township like that one a buyer's buggy in a man's lane was news. And news was about the only crop that had come in that year. The three of them were Norval Spate, who fed more corn than any man in the township, 400 acres of it, and a double crib and a steam sheller. Coy Dunbar, who ran the elevator scale at Ashgrove and therefore knew what every man in 9 miles had in his crib to the bushel. And Tolliver Means, who farmed 160 acres of good black ground and had an opinion about every acre he could see from his own porch. Spate was the one who said it, and it went around the township by Sunday, and it stuck to Harmon Teal for the next 5 months, the way a name sticks when it is a good one. The only man in Iowa, Spate said, who can starve to death with 90 acres of timber and 200 deer. They were not deer. But you could see why he said it, and in that country, in that year, the joke had a hook in it, because the 90 acres was the whole argument, and everybody knew it, and everybody but Harmon Teal had been on the same side of it for 30 years. Ashgrove Township ran on corn the way a mill runs on water. That was not an opinion, it was the shape of the place. The ground was black to a depth that made men from the east take off their hats, and it grew corn, and corn was too bulky and too cheap to ship far, so the township had solved that the way the whole corn belt had solved it. You did not haul the corn. You walked it to town inside a hog. Every man in 9 miles could do the arithmetic in his sleep, and Coy Dunbar at the elevator did it out loud whether a man asked him to or not. 11 bushels of corn laid 240 pounds on a good improved hog. Corn in a fair year sat at 30 cents a bushel, so a fat hog carried about $3 of corn in its ribs and sold for $8 and change, and the difference was the wage the township paid itself for a year of standing in the sun. It was thin, and it had always been thin, but it worked every single year, and a system that works every single year gets into a place so deep that a man who does not use it stops looking merely different and starts looking like a reproach. Harmon Teal farmed 210 acres. 120 of it was in cultivation, corn and oats and a little clover, no better and no worse than his neighbors, and he made no argument with anybody about that ground. It was the other 90 that put a burr under the saddle of the entire township. 90 acres of standing timber on the rolling ground where the land broke down toward Yellow Branch. Old white oak with the pale flaking bark and the round-lobed leaves. Burr oak with acorns the size of a pullet egg sitting in a fringed cap. Black oak and shagbark hickory on the higher shoulders, pawpaw and hazel in the bottoms, and a spring that ran cold all the way through the year 1901, in which 3 wells on that road quit. Every acre of it was as good corn ground as any man ever put a plow in, and everybody knew that too. Tolliver Means had figured it once with a pencil on the back of a seed catalog standing in the elevator, and he had figured it loud enough that Harmon heard him from the doorway. 90 acres, 60 bushel corn, 30 cents a bushel. $1,620 a year, Means said, and the man is growing acorns with it. They had been telling him to grub that timber since Grant was president. His own father had meant to. The neighbors had offered twice to come in with teams and stump pullers and powder and do the clearing on shares, which in that country was as near to charity as men ever came, and both times Harmon had thanked them and fed them dinner and said no. He had one answer, and he gave it the same way every time, so that after 30 years the township could say it along with him. The ground under it is good, he said, and it will still be good in 10 years. It is not going anywhere, and neither am I. But you cannot grow a white oak back inside a lifetime. If I am wrong about the corn, I can plow it in 1 season. If I am wrong about the trees, I am wrong forever. There was a second reason, and only 2 people had ever heard it, and one of them had been dead 7 years. Ada Teal came to that farm as a bride in 1866 and lived on it until the spring of 1894. It was Ada who made him promise about the timber, and not for any soft reason either. She had grown up in Ohio on ground her father cleared and then lost, and she had watched 3 cash crops in a row fail on it. And she had a saying that Harmon repeated to himself in bad years the way another man might have said a psalm. A farm with only one way to make money, she said, has only one way to fail. She was buried up on the rise at the north edge of the woods where a person could see the whole home place at once. After she was gone, he did not put a plow in the timber, and he did not marry again, and he did not talk about either subject, and the township, having no better information to go on, decided the man was stubborn. He was, but not for the reason they had settled on. The Hogs came down from his father. Old Teely had driven 300 head to Keokuk on foot in 1850, 4 days on the road, and the animal that could do that was the animal Harmon still had standing in his lot. Nobody in that country had bred that kind on purpose since the 70s. When the improved blood came in, the old drove hog went out fast, and the reason was no mystery. It was money. The improved hog was better at exactly one thing, and that one thing was the only thing that mattered when corn was cheap. It stood still in one place and converted, and a man with a full crib in October wanted nothing else on the farm. So the old kind survived only in the ridges and the river breaks where the corn did not go, and the names for it turned into names a man would not use about anything he respected. Land pike, hazel splitter, prairie rooter, elm peeler, because they claimed it would eat bark. Every one of those names is the same joke told 4 ways, and the joke is that the animal was built to travel and to find its own dinner. Harmon had heard all of them for 40 years and used most of them himself, which took the fun out of it for other people, and he had never once claimed his hogs were better. He knew they were not. But that was the whole of it, and nobody in Ash Grove ever finished the sentence. The improved hog was better out of the same trough. Harmon Teely was not feeding out of the same trough. He was feeding out of 90 acres that cost him nothing whatever, and to get at what grew in there an animal had to be able to walk 2 miles in a day, work through 6 inches of leaf mold, crack a bur oak acorn, keep its feet on a side hill, and come home at dark when a man beat on the bottom of a bucket. His neighbors had spent 30 years perfecting a hog that could not do one of those things. Nobody in the township thought of that as a risk. It was not a risk in a normal year. It had not been a risk in 26 years. What the township never saw, because it happened inside the timber where a buggy could not go, was that Harmon Teal did not turn hogs loose in the woods and hope. He ran that 90 acres the way Norval Spate ran a cornfield. And he had a book for it. It was a school tablet with a soft cover, and he had one for every year back to 1879, all of them in a tin box on the shelf over the wash bench, and the first entry in every book was made in the 2nd week of July, and it was a number of acorns. That was the beginning of the whole thing. An oak does not make a crop every year. It makes a heavy one now and then and a light one most of the time, and the heavy years are decided long before anybody can see an acorn by whether the tree flowered into a dry wind in May or into 2 weeks of rain. Rain in bloom time knocks the pollen down, and there is no crop. Harmon had learned that from watching, and not from any book, because in 1881 he had watched the oaks bloom in a downpour and had gone into the winter with 200 hogs and nothing to feed them. So every July he walked the timber with a hoop of number 9 wire 2 feet across and a stick, and he stopped under 30 marked trees, the same 30 every year, white oak and bur, and he laid the hoop on the ground and counted what had already dropped, and then he stood back and counted the clusters he could see on the low limbs against the sky. 30 trees, 30 counts into the tablet. A number under 11, and he sold hogs in August. A number over 20, and he bought them. The May of 1901 had been dry. Not dry the way the summer would be dry, but a hard warm wind out of the southwest for 11 days running, straight through the flowering, and the pollen had gone through those woods like smoke off a burning field. He had watched it come off a white oak in a gust and drift down the hollow in a yellow rope. And he had gone back to the house and told the young man who worked for him that they would be keeping every shoat they had. The young man was Del Prather, 24, sandy-haired, and he had come to Harmon 2 years before because nobody else in the township would hire a man who had lost the use of 2 fingers on his left hand in a sheller. Harmon had looked at the hand for about a second and a half and had asked him whether he could count. In the second week of July 1901, in a drought that was already breaking men, the 2 of them walked those 30 trees. The hope count came out at 31. It was the highest number in the tin box. The oaks were carrying a massed crop the like of which that timber had not made since 1888, and the reason was the same 11 days of dry wind in May that had started the drought which was at that moment burning up every cornfield in the county. The same weather. One weather. It had ruined the corn, and it had made the acorns, and there was not one man in Ashgrove Township who knew both halves of that sentence, because 30 years back they had all quit paying attention to the half that did not sell. Harmon ran the timber in 5 sections of about 18 acres, divided by a movable fence of oak hurdles he could pull with a horse, so the drove cleaned one section and went on while the next lay untouched with its mast still on the ground. Every hog had a ring in its nose, a wire through the gristle of the snout that keeps an animal from tearing up the roots of the trees it feeds under. A drove of unrung hogs will ruin a woodlot in 3 seasons. A rung drove picks it clean and leaves the ground looking swept. He salted them twice a week at the same trough at the same hour, which is the whole secret of handling an animal that can outrun a horse, because a hog will not stray from salt. He watered them at the branch, and every April he shoveled the spring pool out so it ran cold and clear all summer, and he walked the drove every evening at 6 with a bucket and a stick and counted them, 365 nights a year, and if the count came up short, he went back in after dark with a lantern until he found what was missing. And he had done that since he was 19 years old. That summer the count ran between 240 and 255 head, counting sows and this year's pigs, which was the largest drove he had ever wintered, because of the number 31 in the tablet. He did one more thing that year, and it was the thing that made the elevator laugh hardest, and it was a habit and not a plan. Harmon Teal never sold his old corn. He raised the same 22 acres as everybody else, and cribbed it and fed some of it, and whatever was left when the new crop came in did not go to town. It went into the second crib, the old log one with the shake roof, and it stayed there. He carried a year behind. Coy Dunbar could look at his own scale book and tell you that Harmon Teal had been holding 400 bushels of last year's corn in a leaky log crib for 11 straight years, while the price went up and down, and other men played it like a hand of cards. Old corn, Dunbar liked to say, is like an old newspaper. There is nothing in it you have not already read. That was in June. By the middle of September, Coy Dunbar was not saying that anymore, and by the middle of October, there was not one crib of old corn left standing anywhere in Ashgrove Township except one, and it had a shake roof on it, and it had 410 bushels in it, and every man who drove past it on the township road turned his head to look. But that is ahead of the story. In July, the corn was still green enough to lie to a man, and the joke about the man with 90 acres of deer was still a funny one. The corn went in the last 10 days of July, and it went fast, and a man who has not seen a corn crop die of heat cannot picture how fast is. It had come up beautifully. That was the cruelty of it. There had been rain in the middle of May, the fields stood a good even color into the last week of June, and the whole county was talking about 65 bushels. Then the wind swung into the southwest and stayed there, and the rain quit entirely, and one afternoon in the third week of July, the thermometer on the north wall of the Ashgrove elevator read 109 in the shade. And Coy Dunbar wrote it on the wall in pencil because he did not believe anybody would take his word for it. Corn will stand heat if it has water. It had no water. The leaves rolled at 8 in the morning, and then they rolled and did not open again at night, and then the edges went the color of a paper sack, and the whole field made a dry rattling noise when the wind moved through it that a farmer in that country would rather hear in a nightmare than in daylight. It fired from the bottom up. The tassels shed no pollen worth the name, and where there is no pollen there is no kernel, and when the men went in and pulled a shuck in the second week of August, what they found was a comb 8 inches long with 40 kernels scattered down it like teeth in an old man's jaw. Norval Speight had 400 acres of corn ground that year. He got about 11 bushels an acre off it, and half of that was nubbins. He had 240 head of improved hogs standing in 3 lots, and every one of them was 7 months old and needed 4 more bushels apiece to finish. And he had, when the shelling was done, less than a third of what he had counted on. Corn had opened the season at Ash Grove around 30 cents. In the last week of August, it went to 48. In the second week of September, when the whole country finally understood that the failure was not local, that it was Iowa and Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska all at once, it went to 60. By the first week of October, a man could not buy shelled corn at the Ash Grove elevator at any price, because Coy Dunbar had none to sell. And what came in on the cars from Illinois billed out at 66 cents with the freight in it, which was more than double what any man in that township had ever paid for a bushel of corn in his life. And there is the trap, and it closed on the whole corn belt inside of 6 weeks. A half-fat hog is the most expensive thing on a farm. It eats every day, whether it gains or not. A man in that position has 2 roads. He can buy 66-cent corn and finish his hogs and pray the market pays him for it, or he can quit and sell them where they stand and take whatever a buyer gives him for a hog that is not finished. Everybody quit at the same time. That is what nobody planned for. 200,000 men made the same reasonable decision inside the same 30 days, and the country's stockyards filled up with half-fat hogs, and the price came apart in their hands. Hogs had been $3.40 the hundredweight in June. The last week of September they were 3 even. By the third week of October, for a light half-finished hog, the buyers at Delphos were paying $2.55, and they were choosy at that. Norval Speight sold 240 head on the 11th of October. Harmon Teal happened to be at the depot that day for a keg of nails, and he watched them come up the chute, and he did not say anything to anybody about it, then or later. They were good hogs. That was the thing. They were bred right, and they were clean, and they were exactly what the whole township had spent 30 years learning how to make, and they came off those wagons light and rough-coated and long in the flank, and Speight stood by the scale with his hat in his hand and watched the weights go up on the board. He got a check that afternoon for $904 and some cents on 240 head for a year of work with $4,000 of ground rent and labor standing behind it. 2 other men in Ash Grove sold out the same week. Tolliver Means sold 90 head. The Bunce brothers over east sold their whole herd, including the sows, which is a thing a man only does once, because when the sows go the farm is not in the hog business anymore. It is only a place where hogs used to be. And all through those 6 weeks, men kept coming up Harmon Teal's lane to tell him to sell. They meant it kindly, most of them, and that is the part that got left out of the story afterward. By October, nobody was laughing. They were frightened, and a frightened man wants everybody standing where he is standing. Coy Dunbar drove out on a Sunday and told him plain that hogs would be 2 1/4 by Thanksgiving. Ellis Crabb came back up the lane in the same buggy and offered $2.10 the hundredweight for the whole drove sight unseen, which was an insult with a friendly face on it, and Harmon thanked him for it and did not take it. The banker at Delphos, a careful man named Ruddock who had never in his life said a cruel word to anybody, wrote Harmon a letter in the middle of October. It was 1 page, and it was polite, and its whole meaning was in a single sentence in the middle of it. In view of conditions this fall, the letter said, the bank would look favorably upon any reduction of stock which would permit an early reduction of the note. Harmon owed that bank $380 against a mower and a new well casing. He wrote back the same evening, 4 lines, and said that the note would be paid in full in February and that he preferred to sell his hogs when they were fat rather than when they were not. Then, in the 3rd week of October, a man from a stave and heading mill at Ottawa drove out and walked the timber with a scribe rule and offered him $640, cash on the stump, for the standing white oak. Only the white oak. It would have paid the note twice over and left him $400 in a year, when $400 in that township was a fortune. He walked the whole 90 acres with that man. He was polite about it. At the end of it, he stood at the north edge where the ground rises near the fence around Ada's stone, and he told the man no, and the man asked him why, because he plainly could not understand it, and Harmon gave him an answer that got repeated later in the county paper. "Those trees," he said, "are what is feeding 250 hogs this minute. You are offering me $640 for my corn crib." While the township was selling, Harmon Teely was doing 2 things that looked to everybody like a man throwing good money after bad. The first was that in the 2nd week of August, when his own corn was as dead as anybody's, he hitched to the drill and put 18 acres of that dead field into turnips and rape. Seed money on ground that had already failed once in the middle of a drought in a year when men were counting nickels. Tolliver Means saw the drill going and told it at the elevator that evening and got the laugh he came for. It rained on the 29th of August, an inch and a tenth, the first real rain since June, and it rained again in the middle of September. Turnips and rape do not need a summer. They need 6 weeks and 1 good rain, and they got both, and by the 1st of November there stood 18 acres of feed on ground that had grown nothing that year, and Harmon turned the drove onto it and let them hog it off where it grew, which is the cheapest feeding a man ever does because the animal does the harvesting. The second thing was that he did not sell 1 hog in October. The mast started dropping the 1st week of September. White oak comes first, and it is the sweet one, low in the bitter, and the hogs will clean the white oak ground before they touch anything else. Then the bur oaks let go, the big fat acorns in the fringed caps, and after the first hard frost in October, the black oaks finally became worth eating, because frost takes some of the bite out of them. The floor of that timber that fall was covered so thick in places that a man walking through it rolled underfoot as if he were walking on ball bearings. Harmon weighed a marked barrow on the crib scale on the 1st of every month, the same animal, and the numbers in the tablet for 1901 read 168 pounds on the 1st of August, 214 on the 1st of October, and 262 on the 1st of December. That is 94 pounds of gain in 4 months on an animal that had not eaten 1 kernel of corn in the worst feed year the state had ever had, in a township where men were selling half-fat hogs at a loss 9 miles away. There was one night in that fall he did not talk about afterward. Norval Spate had kept 38 gilts back when he sold, meaning to hold his breeding stock, and then had found himself with nothing whatever to feed them. On the night of the 22nd of October, somebody cut 3 strands of wire on the north line of Harmon's timber and put those 38 gilts through the gap, and by the time Harmon walked his evening count, he had 38 strange hogs in his Section 4 and a hole in his fence. He never found out who cut it, and he never once said in public that he thought he knew. He got Del Prather up before light, and the 2 of them drove those gilts back down the road to Spate's place, 9/10 of a mile, and put them in the lot and fixed the gate. Spate came out on the porch and stood there and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing a man could say. 2 days later, Harmon hauled 100 bushels out of the old log crib and put it in Spate's crib and told him he would take 29 cents for it, which was what it had cost him to raise it the year before, and not the 66 cents that the elevator was asking that week and could not fill. Spate tried to argue with him about the price, which tells you something about Spate, and Harmon would not argue, which tells you something about Harmon. That left 310 bushels in the old crib, and he had a use for every kernel of it, and it was not charity that he kept the rest. Because here's the part the township did not know, and here is the whole hinge of the year. Acorn fat is soft. Any packing house man will tell you so, and be short about it. A hog finished on nothing but mast or on peanuts down south lays on a fat that is oily and slack, that will not stand up in a curing room, that goes yellow and rank on the hook, and that the buyers dock a man for on sight. If Harmon Teal had driven 203 acorn hogs to Delphos in December, he would have been paid less than Spate got, and the story would have ended there, and the joke about the deer would have lasted him the rest of his life. The old drovers knew the answer, and Harmon's father had written it in the front of the first tablet in the tin box in 1879 in pencil in a hand like a fence line. Mast for the frame, corn for the finish. 40 days of hard corn at the end will pull the fat firm again. Not 4 months. 40 days, 2 bushels to the head, fed dry on a clean floor, and the animal comes to the block with white hard fat and a loin that cuts clean, and the curing rooms will pay a premium for it because it takes a long cure, and it hangs a year, and it does not go rank. 203 head. 2 bushels apiece. 406 bushels, and there were 410 in the old log crib with the shake roof that Coy Dunbar had been telling the same joke about for 11 years, and Harmon had hauled 100 of them to a man who had likely cut his fence, and there were 310 left, and he bought 96 more at 66 cents off the cars in Delphos in January, which cost him $63 in change and was the only feed bill he paid all year. He started the corn on the 10th of January, and he fed it in the lot where the drove could be watched, and he kept the count every evening at 6 with the bucket and the stick. On the 29th of January, a buggy came up the lane with 2 men in it. One of them was Ellis Crabb, who had refused to bid in August. The other was a heavy-set stranger in a good overcoat named Vance Ordway, who bought hogs for a packing house at Ottawa that put up export bacon and long-cure hams for the English trade, and who had not personally walked a farm lot in 6 years. Crabb had told him, "That is the part of this that deserves saying plainly," because Ellis Crabb had every reason to keep his mouth shut and did not. He had sat in a hotel dining room in Ottawa in January listening to Ordway complain that there was not a hard fat hog to be had in the state of Iowa that winter, that everything on the market had been dumped half-finished in the fall, and the rest was soft as butter. And Ellis Crabb had put down his fork and said, "There is a man in Ashgrove Township with 200 head of the ugliest hogs you ever saw, and I think he has been feeding them acorns since Labor Day." Vance Ordway walked into that lot in a good overcoat and a pair of city shoes, and stood among 200 long-nosed grizzled hogs, and did not say a word for 2 full minutes. Then he did what a buyer does, which has not changed in 100 years. He got a hand on a barrow and ran it down the back and along the flank, and he pinched the fat over the last rib between his thumb and 2 fingers and held it there. And Ellis Crabb, standing at the fence, said afterward that he watched a man's whole face change over about 4 seconds. "Firm," Ordway said. It was not a question, and it was not said to anybody in particular. 40 days on corn, Harmon said. Started the 10th. What before that? Acorns, white oak and burr, then the black oak after frost. Turnips and rape through November. Ordway went down the row and handled 6 more, one at a time, and every one of them was the same. Then he asked the only question that was left, which was, how many? And Harmon told him 203 head fit to go, and the rest were breeding stock, and were not for sale at any figure he cared to name. The market at Delphos that week was $5.60 the hundredweight for choice heavy hogs, because the fall dumping had emptied the country of pork, and by February the packing houses were bidding against each other for anything that came in fat. Ordway offered $6.15 delivered at the Delphos yards, and he offered it in the lot with his glove off and his hand out, and he did it because a curing room that has contracted to hang bacon for the English trade cannot hang soft pork at any price, and he had been hunting the state of Iowa for 6 weeks for exactly what was standing in front of him. They drove them in on the 11th of February, 9 miles, on foot. That detail is the one the county paper printed and the one the old men in that township were still telling in 1930. 203 hogs walked 9 miles to the depot in a February morning and came into the yards at Delphos with their ears up. Del Prother was at the head of the drove with a bucket. Harmon was at the back with a stick he never once used for anything but pointing. It took them from 4 in the morning until 9:30, and they lost nothing, and nothing went down. There was not another drove of hogs in Ashgrove Township in 1902 that could have walked to the mailbox. That was the 30 years of improvement, standing in the lots on both sides of that road, watching a 150-year-old kind of animal go by at 3 miles an hour in the cold. Men came out to watch. That is a true thing about country places, that news travels through them faster than a man can walk, and by the time the drove came down the last 2 miles into town there were rigs pulled off in the ditch and men standing on wagon boxes, and among them, near the scale house at the yards, were the 3 of them. Norval Spate, Coy Dunbar, Tolliver Means. They weighed at the Delphos yards on a scale that the state inspector had sealed in November. The drove weighed in at 54,404 pounds, which is an average of 268 pounds a head. At $6.15, the hundredweight that came to $3,345.85. Off that came the yardage and the commission and the freight to Ottawa, $221.25. The check that Vance Ordway wrote in the scale house at Delphos on the 11th of February, 1902, was for $3,124.60. Coy Dunbar was standing near enough to see the figure written, and Coy Dunbar could not keep a number to himself if his life depended on it, so the whole township had it by Wednesday. Norval Spate had received $904 for 240 head in October, with 400 acres of ground behind that check. Harmon Teal had received $3,124.60 for 203 head that had eaten about 400 bushels of corn among the whole drove, and the 90 acres that grew the rest of it had cost him nothing but the taxes, $22.40 for the year. He paid the note at Delphos that afternoon, $380, and Mr. Ruddock came out from behind the counter to shake his hand, which was a thing he did not do often. And in April, men started coming up that lane again, but not to tell him anything. They came to buy boars. Not to switch over. Nobody switched over. The improved hog was still the right hog in a normal year, and everybody, including Harmon, knew it. What they wanted was a cross, half the old blood, for legs and lung and a nose that could work a woodlot, on top of the improved sows they had left, so a man might have 30 or 40 head on the place that could find their own dinner if a year ever came again like 1901. He sold 11 boars that spring at $18 a head, and one of the 11 went to Norval Spate, who came up the lane and stood at the rail and said what he had to say, and Harmon let him say it, and then sold him the boar and never mentioned October to him or to anybody else as long as he lived. The Delphos paper ran it in March under a headline that was longer than the story, and the piece has one sentence in it worth keeping, and it is Harmon's own, and it is the answer he gave the man who asked him why he had held on when everybody else sold. "I did not do anything smart," he said. "I just kept 2 things that everybody else had got rid of, and one year the weather asked for them. The timber is the end of it." He never cleared it. The tablets in the tin box run on to 1922. 30 years of July acorn counts in that same square pencil hand, and the number for 1901, 31, is still the highest one in the box. If you had driven past that place on an evening in the fall of 1902 at the hour when the sun is down in the trees and everything on a farm goes gold, you would have seen an old man at the rail of a hog lot with his hand flat on the top board, watching a drove of long-nosed, grizzled hogs come up out of the timber at a walk because he had beat on the bottom of a bucket. And down the fence line, 3 men leaning on the same rail, saying nothing. They had been saying for 30 years that 90 acres of oak was 90 acres of wasted ground. It was not wasted. It was the second way to make money on that farm, and it stood there doing nothing at all for 26 years, which is the exact reason it was worth something in the 27th, and Ada Teal had told him so in 1866. And he had listened, and that was the whole of it.